Well, hello there. In today's video, we're going to talk about exporting and export regions within Reaper. There's a bunch to cover, so let's get into it. Okay, so here we are in Reaper, and I just have a layered sound here, just two sounds playing at once that we're going to export as one final sound, which is typically more often than not what you do with sound design, though there are circumstances where you export each layer individually. But for these circumstances, we're going to export both of these as one combined file in the end. But I'm just going to play the sound for you just so you can hear what it is. So we have kind of this impact sweetener at the very beginning that I always like to put on when I have any sort of impact. I usually have some sort of thud or thunk or something like that that you don't necessarily hear on its own, but when combined with the second layer, it adds just a little bit of extra life to it. And that's the second layer. So we have these two layers playing together, making a final sound. These two sounds are just from libraries, nothing special, but they will be perfect for demonstrating export regions and exporting in general when it comes to Reaper, especially when it comes to game audio and sound design. So most of the time when people want to render something or bounce it, they're just similar terms, bouncing and rendering or exporting. What they'll do is they'll go to File and they will go to Render. Now, typically the settings that you'll have will look something like this, something similar to this, where it'll say source, master mix, and the bounds will be the entire project, meaning it'll bounce the entire project using the master fader, meaning it's going to process all the effects, everything that's going through every individual channel, and every effect that's on the master fader as well. Don't worry about this thing that says region here. We're going to get to that in a second. But generally, that's how people export, a song or something like that. But typically, when we're working with sound design, we have hundreds, if not thousands of sounds living within a project. So if we just exported the entire project, that wouldn't work so well because then it would just be one really, really long file with all these different sounds back to back. Now, you could export each individual file by just clicking and dragging over each one, making a time selection and exporting based off of that every single time you want to export a different sound. But that's also not really time efficient as well. We want to make sure that this is a very fast process, and Reaper allows us to do sound design exporting crazy fast, and that's the reason I switched from Logic to Reaper for sound design specifically. Now, typically a sound design project will look something like this. Now, I'm just going to duplicate this folder here, so I'm just going to get multiple versions of this kind of explosion, and I'm going to drag these other sounds out here. So pretend that these other files here are different sounds. We're working with the same one just for hypotheticals, but pretend that these other two kind of containers are different sounds. Typically, your sound design project will look something like this. You'll have a bunch of kind of stair-stepped combined layers going down and to the right of your project so that when you export certain areas of sound, these two will be exported together, these two will be exported together, and on and on. And the same applies if you have hundreds of layers per sound or just two. So we want to make sure that we don't have a bunch of overlapping sounds, so that when we export certain areas of time, we are only getting the layers that we want, which is why we're having this kind of stair-stepped kind of approach. This is very common look for how sound design projects look as you have more and more sounds. So when we do have tons of sounds to export and rename and make sure they're all in the right file format and all that sort of stuff, we have a feature that we can use called regions within Reaper. Now, if you've used Cubase or Nuendo or other DAWs, I'm sure they do this too, they do have kind of features that let you export based off of regions, and this is very similar to that, and it allows you a lot of control and a lot of customization on how you export stuff. And this may seem kind of banal, but when, again, you're working with thousands of sounds, it makes a huge difference. It makes a massive difference in how much time you can save when exporting all these different sounds and working with them and naming them and putting them in the right place. So what we're going to do is we're going to set up regions, and I'll show you what those are in a second, for each of these three different sound files so that when we want, we can just export these three files all at once with just the click of a button. Now, if that's not clear yet what I mean, don't worry, you'll see it in visuals just a second. So the first thing I want to do is show you the way I like to make regions. Now, there's tons of different ways to do it, but I found this way to be very, very efficient. So I'm going to bring up my action list by hitting Shift ? And I am going to type in insert region. So we have a option here that I really like called markers. Insert region from selected items and edit. Now, if I just type in region up here, we get tons and tons of options, and I recommend you explore these as you understand regions more and more, because there are a lot of good features that regions can do for us within Reaper, but we're not going to get into those in this video. So I'm just going to go back to insert region. And again, the one we are concerned about with this kind of video and this sort of process is called insert region from selected items and edit. Now I have this set to Option Shift C, but you can set it to whatever you want. And I'm going to show you what that does in just a second. So let's say I want to make a region, which is basically an area of time that I can designate to export certain sounds within. The way I can do that is highlight by right-clicking and dragging these two files. So I'm just going to right-click and drag these two files, and I'll hit my shortcut, which is Shift Option C. Now, two things just happened. At the very top here, you'll see this kind of teal, dark teal, greenish sort of region appear. And this is basically saying, okay, within the bounds of this amount of time, you can export everything that lives within this zone. So it's going to export these two sounds as one final sound or as layers. And we can show you how to do that in just a second and how you can determine what you're exactly exporting. So I'm going to rename this. Let's say I'll call it like Explosion. Got a new keyboard, so it's weird to type. Explosion version 1. So let's say that's what I'm calling it. And so now we have a region called Explosion V1. Don't worry about what's happening at the bottom of the screen here. I'm going to show you that in just a second. So I'm going to do the same exact thing for these other two files. Let's say hypothetically, again, let's pretend that these are different sounds that I'm working with. So I'm going to right click and drag all of the files that are within that final file. So it's going to be all the layers within that final sound. I'm going to Shift Option C. I'm going to just type in Explosion _ version 2, let's say. And I can right click and drag, Shift Option C, Explosion version 3. And I'm just making these file names up. These aren't typical industry standard file naming conventions. Every game is different, just as a heads up. So now you'll see at the top, I have 3 different regions, all showing me different bounds of time that I can export all at once. But there's still more setup that we need to do. To tell Reaper which areas we want to actually export, which regions we want to export, we need to open up something called the region render matrix, which is the thing that you're seeing at the bottom of the screen here. But let me show you how to bring that up. So I'm going to bring up my action list with Shift question mark, and I'm going to type in region render matrix. And there is a shortcut that I recommend you set up called View Show Region Render Matrix Window. And basically this shows this screen at the bottom that you're seeing here. And my shortcut for that is Command Shift R. Again, choose whatever you want, but I recommend you set up all these shortcuts as we go along this series, because these are going to be some of the most used things that you use basically every single day as a sound designer. So I'm going to hit Command Shift R to get rid of that. So I just took it away. If you take a shortcut and press it again and again, it just closes or reopens that window. So when I press X, which is my mixer key, it just brings it up and closes it. So I'm going to hit Shift Command R, and we get this region render matrix at the bottom. And basically what this allows us to do is essentially check boxes that say, okay, I want to render or export or bounce, same thing, for at least for our purposes, they're all the same thing. I want to export this zone of time, so Explosion V1, and I wanted to export these tracks that I select, whichever tracks I select. So for example, if I have Explosion V1 here, so that's my region of Explosion version 1, this very first one on the far left, I can click this box here, this very first box, which is our first Explosion folder right here that I'm mousing over right here. So what this will do is this will say, okay, when I export, and we'll get to how to do that, the mechanics of how to do that in a second. When I export these regions in just a second, it's going to export Explosion V1 based off of this track here, this Explosion track right here. But if I were to click, let's say, the second Explosion track right here, it will also export based off of the second track, but in this area of time. So the sound would actually be silent because this second Explosion folder track that I'm mousing over right here has no sound within it. It's living all the way over here. So if I export Explosion V1's time bounds, but using this second folder track, it will actually be silent because, again, there's no sound living there. I would need to click Explosion V2, which is where that sound is living in terms of where it is in the time sort of zone inside of Reaper. So theoretically, there are two ways to go about doing this, and there are different ways you can export to your heart's content. I'll show you a few different options. You can click this first explosion folder for explosion V1, this second explosion folder with explosion V2, and this third explosion folder for explosion V3, and it will export each of these sounds in these respective zones correctly. I'll get each of these sounds exported correctly. And I really recommend you experiment with this if this isn't clear, because as soon as you do it, you'll know like, oh, okay, this is how it works. Got it. Great. No problem. But if this isn't clear, again, set up a project like this, do anything, put any sounds together and experiment with this, because it'll become extremely, extremely, extremely clear as soon as you try it out. So I'm going to uncheck those because there's also another option I can use at the very top here called Master Mix. So I could theoretically choose these three time bounds that I want to export as. And what this will do is it will export based off of not these folder tracks, but the master mix. So theoretically, if I have effects on this master channel, they will not be processed if I'm just exporting based off of the folders, but they will be processed if I use the master mix. So what this will do is basically take it through all the channels, all the chains that I have set up and the master fader and export it, as opposed to if I click each of these individual folders, it will not. It will just export based off of the plugins and chains I have set up on those individual folders. So keep that in mind. Try it out. Again, experiment with it. Try it out by putting some effects on your master channel and then try exporting based off of the master mix and based off of these folders. Now, one last thing I want to show you how to do, and you should really understand how to do this, because sometimes you want to export each of these layers individually. Maybe you need to export stems for your music track, whatever it may be. You can also click all tracks, and this will export each of these tracks individually, or I can just choose these two kind of individual tracks within each time bound, and I'll get exports of each of these individual files named correctly, which I'll show you how to do in a second, very, very, very quickly and very, very easily. So if I'm writing a piece of music and I want to export the drums and violin and the guitar and all that sort of stuff separately, I would click something like this, or I could even just click the All Tracks button up here and it would export all of these as individual files. So in this case, I am just going to click the master mix on all three of these because that just makes things a lot easier and a lot simpler. We don't actually have any plugins going through here, so it'll sound the same no matter what we do, but this will make things a little bit simpler. So this is what we have. We have our export regions set to master mix 1, 2, and 3. I'm going to show you how to actually render those. But before we get into rendering, you know what time it is. It's tea time with Dane. Okay, so we're back, and what we're going to do is we're going to render these regions out to different files. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go to File, Render, or you can set up a shortcut for that. I recommend you do by going to your action list, which is Shift ? For me, and I'm just going to say Render. And for me, my shortcut for render project to disk, which is the render menu, is Command Option R. Again, set it to whatever you want, but definitely set up a shortcut for this. So I'm going to hit Command Option R, or you can go to File and Render, and we have our render menu pop up. So nothing crazy there. You already saw it earlier. But we need to tell Reaper, okay, instead of exporting the master mix of the entire project, we want to export based off of these regions we have set up. So what I'm going to do is go to Source at the very top left here, and I am going to choose Region Render Matrix. So basically this is saying, okay, we are going to export our files based off of what we set up in our Region Render Matrix down here. Cool. And then there's bounds. It's going to say which kind of regions do you want to set up. We already set that up down here, so we can just leave that at all project regions. And now the interesting part happens. So we can choose where we're going to export these files. Nothing crazy there. And what we can also do is determine the file name. And we usually, almost always, when I'm doing this, want the file name to be based off of the region that I made. So in this case, I want the final files to be Explosion version 1, Explosion version 2, and Explosion version 3. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you something called Wildcards. So in the right-hand section here, you'll see a button called Wildcards. And these are just variables. These are variables that get data inserted to them based on different parameters you have set up or things that are happening on your computer. So for example, when I hit Wildcards and go to project information, there's things like tempo. So it'll name the file based off of the tempo, or region, which is the one we're interested in, or marker or parent. There's so many different choices you can make, or just the track name individually. I like to use region because it makes sense that our files will be named based off of the region that we're using. So you can choose this one that says $region. So now when we export our files, they'll be named based off of these individual regions. So we'll have Explosion version 1, version 2, and version 3 as our final files. Now, typically when you're working in game audio, kind of point sounds that you're putting in the world that aren't necessarily UI elements or any sort of music or things like that, typically you're going to export those as mono. Not every single time, but more often than not, a lot of your sound design will be mono. And more often than not, the kind of sample rate that you're going to be using with a lot of games is 48 kilohertz, exporting as waves. So it'll be 48 mono, not for every sound, but for a lot of different sounds, especially if they're in the world, like something like an explosion. And the format will be wave. Again, this isn't true of every single situation, but it's true of many, 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 many situations. So we have our 48 kilohertz sound. We have our mono set up. We have it called wave. It's going to be a wave file, which is great. That's exactly what we want. Pretty much every game engine plays nicely with wave files. And we have our region render matrix set up. It's named to the $region wildcard, so it's going to be named appropriately. We're all set up and ready to go, but I want to show you one last thing, which is really, really important. And that's making a preset out of this. So I recommend, when you set this up for the first time, go to presets and then go to all settings. And I'm going to blur some of these out because some of them are secret based off of different projects I'm working on, and go to save preset. You can name it whatever you want, and then you'll have that preset to call on every single time. You can just go to presets and then you can find it and you can click it and it will reset everything to be appropriately set up. So all of this will be good and set up and you'll be good to go. And this is how you export. So I'm going to hit render and you'll see what happens. This little box shows up and it shows you that it's rendering and all that sort of good stuff. And I'm going to hit show in Finder. Now, it may be a different button if you're on PC, like show in Explorer or something like that. I've never used Reaper on a PC. You'll know. You're smart. You get it. So I'm going to hit show in Finder. And now we have our 3 sounds that just popped up here. Close this Finder window. And we have these 3 sounds. There's our 3 explosion layers right there, ready to go, easy peasy. So you can also choose where these files are going to go. So you can notice that they went into, you notice that they went into an audio folder here, like exporting tutorial /audio. You can make a new folder right here. I can call it like /bounces and I'll export into, it'll make a new folder and call it /bounces. You can do this however you want. But it makes things much, much easier and so easy to manage. Now, one last thing I want to show you before we end today is secondary output formats. Now, this is great. This is recent in Reaper. If you click the secondary output format button, you can also choose to export this file as something else. So maybe as an MP3. Don't use MP3s in games. They usually don't play nicely, but if you wanted to export a track as a wave for being uncompressed and MP3 for being compressed to share with your friends or whatever, you can do that both at the same time and I'll export both of these files at the same time. So you can have multiple different file formats all taken care of all at once, which is extremely, extremely handy. And you'll see here down here, it'll say render 6 files as opposed to 3 because we're rendering 3 WAV files and 3 MP3 files. Okay, that's it for this exporting tutorial. I hope that was eye-opening for you, for those of you who are newer to Reaper, and you can see the kind of potential here that makes it very clear that if you're working with lots of sounds or lots of tracks or lots of stems, it makes your work so much faster. So if you like this video, of course, hit like, comment, and subscribe and all that sort of good stuff. And if you want to work in the field full-time as a game audio professional, musician, composer, sound designer, whatever it may be, then sign up for my newsletter. It's easily the best resource for those of you who want to make an actual full-time living working in the game industry, giving you things like free ebooks, 2 free courses that will teach you how to network and work within the game industry, teaching how to network online and find work, especially during a pandemic like right now when you can't actually go to meet people in person, find work no matter where in the world you are, all that sort of good stuff. So sign up for that newsletter down in the description below and the card up above, and you'll get 2 free courses and free sounds that will kind of push you along the path of working in game audio full time. So thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next one.